Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to my story. I'm going to immediately hand you over to Emmanuel Grodzinski, who's going to tell us about his journey in 1964 to the Kotel. Please, can you just keep an eye that you are muted the whole time, because sometimes it clicks off and it can be disturbing. So, Emmanuel, welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Pleasure, Lawrence, pleasure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking time out on your Sunday morning to come and listen to me. And thanks to Lawrence for giving me this opportunity to tell you about some of my adventures in the Middle East in 1964. In 1964, I was a young man, and this journey that I did had quite an effect on me. Some of the what I'm going to tell you about comes from my memory, but I've also had the benefit of rereading the letters that I wrote home at the time. And for this, I'm indebted to my father, who kept all of them. I developed the habit of letter writing when I was a 10-year-old, and I was sent away to boarding school at Carmel College. Every Sunday afternoon, after tea and before prep, we had to sit down and write a letter home. I was at Carmel for nearly 6 years, and I carried on writing home during my spell at Gateshead Yeshiva, and during the time that I spent as a 20-year-old living in New York and traveling around the USA. On this 1964 trip, I wrote altogether 62 letters and cards, averaging 2 a week, and they've been very helpful. Anyway, here we go. In February that year, I left London to travel by car to Israel. I was 23. Why did I choose Israel, and why then? Well, I had just completed 5 years studying to become a chartered accountant, and before joining the family bakery business, I decided to have a year off, a sort of belated gap year. What should I do with the time? I thought of becoming a purser on a cruise ship. It seemed like a great way to see the world. Then I considered working as an haute vocational school in Morocco. But in the end, I plumped for Israel. Why? Well, my parents and sisters had already visited, and we had a sizable family there. And I thought that a few months wandering around would give me an understanding of the country. Summer holidays abroad, and those 7 months in America had given me a taste for foreign countries, and I thought that I would spend the summer, after some time in Israel, wending my way slowly back home through Turkey, the Balkans, Central and Western Europe. And the best way to wander, I thought, was to drive. And so I acquired a small car, a sky blue Fiat 500, which I kitted out with snazzy fog lamps and a roof rack. So, a cold Sunday morning in February, saw my family huddled under the porch in front of our house in Norris Lee, nervously waving me off. Travel certainly wasn't a stranger to them, but with hindsight, I can imagine how worried my mother must have been waving me off into the unknown. I took a week to drive down to Naples, watched in trepidation as my precious Fiat was hoisted into the air on a crane and swung down into the hold of our ship, the Moledet, and then spent a relaxing few days on board as the ship sailed calmly to Haifa. In 1964, Israel was enjoying a period of relative security and prosperity. The memory of the austerity years of the 50s was beginning to fade, and the Sinai campaign of 1956 had removed the constant fear of imminent invasion. And so for the next couple of months, I drove and hiked the length and breadth of the country. In those pre-1967 days, this wasn't difficult. The country was small, and in spite of the varied geology, it had a comfortable feel, and it was easy to get around. And in fact, so much was I enjoying the country that I decided to change my travel plans. I reckoned that as Europe was on my doorstep, I could always go there for holidays, but the only way that I'd really get to know Israel was by living and working there for the rest of the year. And so that is what I decided to do. I acquired a temporary residence permit, which would allow me to work, and which introduced me to the Byzantine levels of Israeli bureaucracy, found a job with Barclays Bank, Dominion Colonial and Overseas, who decided that I was just the person for their foreign desk at their main branch in Jerusalem, and a flat, which a friend of a friend needed looking after for a few months. So I was all set. But there was something that I wanted to go before starting work. Since arriving in Israel, Jerusalem had been my base, and sometimes I would climb to the top of the Church of the Dormition on Har Zion and gaze across into the old city. You couldn't see much, really, just the outer walls and the top of the Dome of the Rock. But it was enough to whet my appetite, and I developed an urge to see the Kotel. In 1964, only diplomats and UN personnel could cross into East Jerusalem from the west, and so I devised a circular journey through Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Jordan to approach Jerusalem from the east. I would sail from Haifa to Istanbul, hitchhike across Turkey into Iran, and then after visiting Syria and Lebanon, I would fetch up in Jordan, which was then in control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Here, I encountered my first problem. To visit these countries, I would need visas. The visas required you to state your religion. Putting Jewish on the application form was clearly out of the question. So I hit on the idea of stating that I was a Seventh-day Adventist. My knowledge of the religion was limited to the fact that, although Christians, they observe Shabbat on Saturday rather than Sunday. I discovered this useful fact from a kindly driver who had once given me a lift while I was hitchhiking from Gateshead to Durham. The only visa that I could get in Israel was one for Turkey. The others I would have to pick up in Istanbul. As I decided not to drive through these countries, I put my car in bond and repaired to Haifa. The ship to Istanbul, the SS Adana, was Turkish. First class was the epitome of Edwardian luxury, all cut glass crystal and red stuffed banquettes. Needless to say, I was travelling in steerage, where the accommodation was so awful, not to mention a death trap in the event of catastrophe, that I spent 4 nights on the crossing sleeping on deck. When we arrived in Istanbul, the first thing I did, of course, was to go to the post office to see if there were any letters waiting for me. I sometimes regret the passing of the need for poste restante. Getting an email or text is so immediate. Gone is the excited anticipation of entering those cavernous general post offices to see whether you have mail. As often as not, you were left disappointed, but the exhilaration of occasionally finding a batch waiting for you was worth it. Then I headed for the Grand Bazaar. This was my first experience of an Oriental market, and I was gobsmacked. Such exotic wares and aromas, silks and spices, daggers and ceramics, leather and copper, much of it exquisitely made. I bought the usual souvenir, a monkey puzzle ring. This consisted of 4 rings which nestled into each other only if folded in a certain way. I separated the 4, but then of course couldn't get them back together, and it took me most of the way to Tehran before I could work it out. Some of my shipmates were returning to Europe. I went to the railway station to wave them off, and had a brief, a very intense bout of homesickness as they boarded the Orient Express. Signboards slotted into the outside of the carriage in Istanbul, Belgrade, Venice, and Zurich, Paris, London, Victoria, and I realised that were I to jump on board, I could be home in 4 days. But I was for the east, and so I resolutely turned in that direction. My passport stamped with colourful visas, I crossed the Bosporus ferry, no bridges in those days, and headed for Bursa. There were 3 reasons for going to Bursa. It contained the tomb of Sultan Mehmet II, who had conquered Istanbul in 1453, the only mosque in Turkey with a green roof, and a Turkish bath. It was the baths, of course, that I was really interested in. In my mind's eye, the masseurs would be slim maidens, clad in diaphanous robes, my pleasure their only desire. Soft hands would wash away the dust of my troubles and caress my weary body with aromatic oils. But something got lost in the translation, and instead I found myself lying on a cold, wet marble floor where a rather fat man with a lugubrious look poked and pinched and rubbed and scratched, slapped and banged, pummeled, pulled, pushed, wrenched and tickled me until I was completely wrecked. "You can get up now," he said, but I couldn't, at least not for a long time. Turkey, east of Ankara, is wild and mountainous, and in 1964 the roads were so bad that distances were measured in parts of the day rather than in kilometres. I hadn't realised what rugged mountain Ireland is like. The towns of any decent size were half a day's journey from each other, and the road often degenerated into a mud bath. Streams running down the mountainsides crossed over the road and had to be forded all the time. The towns often sit above 6,000 feet. I was hitchhiking, and lifts weren't hard to get, but they were usually in lorries whose speeds averaged 25 miles an hour, and it took several days to cross the country. If the lorries were basic, the sleeping accommodation was worse. After a hard day's drive, we would land up at the caravanserai. Everybody slept communally in dormitories, and when I saw the bedding, I decided to sleep on top of the mattress, in my sleeping bag and in my clothes. One night, I got the runs. There was no light and I didn't have a torch, but it wasn't difficult to find my way to the only loo, which was just a hole in the ground. The aroma guided me to it. There was no door, and while I squatted there wondering what on earth I thought I was up to, I was suddenly confronted by a wolfhound. I may not have been happy to see it, and it certainly held no affection for me. Growling ominously, and with saliva dropping from its open jaws, the dog approached nearer and nearer. How to escape? I couldn't. The doorway was narrow, and the dog blocked it completely. And anyway, in my condition, flight was impossible. Thoughts of rabies and worse went through my head, and I wondered how long it would take the family back in London to learn of my demise. But after a seemingly endless, fretful while, the dog gave up and I crawled back to bed. The driver of one lorry who offered me a lift operated an informal taxi service. For a fee, he would pick up fares at the side of the road and drop them off hours or days later. Periodically, I offered to pay him, but grandly he waved away my offer. Then, late one afternoon, as we neared the top of a mountain pass, he stopped the lorry and he went like this. Most of my cash was stashed safely in a money belt around my waist, and I had only a few notes and coins in my pockets. I offered them all to him. He looked at me, at first scornfully, and then when I didn't come up with any more money, menacingly. There was no one else in the cab, and the road outside was deserted. I was wondering how this would end when he suddenly opened the passenger door, pushed me out, and drove off. I looked around and could see nothing. Night was coming on, and at that altitude, even in May, it was freezing. After waiting a while to see what might turn up, nothing, I hoisted my rucksack and started to walk. I climbed to the top of the pass and then started down the other side. After about an hour, I saw the lights of a small town and hurried on. There was only one small hostel, which fortunately had a room, and I collapsed into bed. I decided that my hitching days in Turkey were over, but the next morning, as I was making my way to the bus station, I saw a mirage in the form of a white Mercedes. with foreign number plates. Anyway, this car, I saw this car with the foreign number plates driving down the road towards me. And junking my resolution to give up hitchhiking, I stuck out my thumb and the driver stopped. It was wonderful, and he was going all the way to Tehran. My worries appeared to be over. But of course they weren't. That evening, we stopped in Erzurum, the largest city in eastern Turkey, and a military base. And where there are soldiers, there are brothels. My host had been on the road for weeks, and he was hungry, and he insisted forcefully that I accompany him. Turkish brothels are, or at least then, were nationalized and located in gated compounds with controlled entry. Prices were fixed. You walked down the central street, inspecting the wares on display. Turks seemed to have a predilection for volume, for all the women were enormously fat, and their clothing concealed little below and nothing above the waist. They were terrifying, and I was appalled. How could I escape? What would happen to me? Was I to be crushed to death, suffocated between the enormous thighs of a Turkish Amazon? A deus ex machina arrived in the form of dissatisfaction by my host, who declared the superiority of the Iranian variety. The next day at the Iranian border, there was yet another mishap. The Iranians had changed the rules, and import tax had now to be paid at the frontier, and my host didn't have the funds. But there were buses, and I made it uneventfully to Tehran. In 1964, some 100,000 Jews lived in Iran, many of them prosperously. I had the name of a Jewish family in Tehran, and they overwhelmed me with hospitality over Shavuot. They took one look at my travelling wardrobe and insisted on kitting me out with a suit for shul. At communal lunches and parties, I met local girls and boys. They were very friendly, but a girl who took my fancy told me that local custom prevented her from showing me around, other than in the company of her parents. But the food was delicious, mounds of lamb and chicken, beef and saffron rice, on which I gorged myself as inconspicuously as I could. I needed to change some money, and I went to the bazaar, where you got the best rates. While bargaining for a silver box, I asked the owner of the stall where I could find a money changer. How much do you want to change? £10. Okay, stay here, have a cup of coffee, and I'll go and change it for you. I agreed. But just as I was about to hand over the note, something warned me, and I said, actually, I'd quite like to see some more of the bazaar. I'll come with you. He glowered, but he conceded the opportunity had gone. Tehran was bustling, crowded and noisy, but not aggressively so. The double-decker buses reminded me of London, except that passenger numbers were so totally uncontrolled that both decks inside were jam-packed and people clung to the sides. I was taken with the letter writers who sat outside the post office, offering reading and writing services. Literary service levels in Iran were, at that time, low, and there was a lot of bureaucracy. So there were always long queues of people waiting to write to or have read letters from loved ones, and in need of having yet another form filled out. I went to have a look at the crown jewels in the Golestan Palace. I'd been brought up on the supremacy of the British Empire and the superiority of its possessions, and had been marvelled at the display in the Tower of London. But these Persian jewels brought me down to earth. The large, clear, beautifully cut diamonds, emeralds, rubies, set in crowns, orbs, and scepters, unimaginable in beauty if you haven't actually seen them. I hitched down to Isfahan and headed for the city centre. The highlight was the Nasht-e-Jahan Square, constructed by Shah Abbas, one of Persia's great rulers, a marvel of simplicity and symmetry. I really should have spent more time in Isfahan. It's a beautiful city, and for some reason or other I didn't. Anyway, on the way back to Tehran, I took in a short visit to Qum. Qum is a very holy city. It is also the hometown of Ayatollah Khomeini, then living in exile in Paris, and of course whom I hadn't heard. As luck or misfortune would have it, my visit coincided with Ashura, the 10th day of the month of Muharram. Ashura is commemorated by Shia Muslims as a day of mourning for the martyrdom of Muhammad's grandson Hussein, who was killed at the Battle of Karbala in 680. At that time, I was ignorant of the resulting schism between Sunni and Shia Islam, and I certainly didn't appreciate the fervour with which Shia Islam commemorates the treachery of Hussein's slaying. And so I was unprepared for the sheer intensity of feeling that greeted me when I entered the courtyard of the Fatima Musaba Mosque, one of the most sacred shrines in the whole of Iran. True, I had been warned that non-Muslims were not welcome in the mosque at the best of times, and clearly, of all days of the year, their Tisha B'Av, this definitely wasn't one of them. But I had a beard, and I was quite sunburnt, and so I thought I would chance it. I was wearing an anorak closed with a zipper. Underneath hung my camera, and in the courtyard, when I thought that no one was looking, I unzipped the, took a couple of snaps and did it up again. Then I made my way towards the mosque itself. The massive entrance doors were with small pieces of mirrored glass, and when the worshippers weren't flagellated themselves with a local version of the cat o' nine tails, they were beating their heads against the glass pieces, drawing more blood. I went inside. In the vestibule stood a large catafalque, said to contain the remains of Fatima, one of Shia Islam's holiest saints. People slowly circled the tomb clockwise, all the while beating their breasts, wailing and chanting prayers. The intensity of the emotion was quite unnerving. Suddenly, I found myself grabbed by my upper arms, lifted bodily, carried towards the exit, and thrown outside. Clearly, I'd been nobbled, and in hindsight, I was lucky to have got off so lightly. It was time to leave Iran, so back in Tehran, I treated myself to a flight to Baghdad. Before I left, I took precautions. Even in my innocence, I knew that Iraq was not a great place for Jews. So I gave my tefillin and the passport that I had used for Israel to a woman who was flying to Tel Aviv, and I asked her to leave them with El Al at Lod Airport. Then I went to the British Embassy, a comforting reminder of the purity of home, with the Union Jack fluttering in the courtyard and the Antigone portraits of the Queen that hung on the walls. I gave them my approximate itinerary: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel, and I asked them, if I haven't reported to the embassy in Tel Aviv within a fortnight, would they please start inquiries? Why, what's the problem, they asked. Well, I'm Jewish, you see. They first told me that under no circumstances should I go, and that if I insisted, they would take no responsibility for my welfare. I passed a sleepless night imagining all sorts of mishaps that might befall me, and when the next morning my flight landed in Baghdad, they seemed to be starting. We all handed in our passports, and while the others were returned quickly, mine wasn't, and I was told to wait. My imagination went into overdrive, but after half an hour, I got it back. I checked into the YMCA in downtown Baghdad and went to explore. I wandered down to the riverbank, where there were dozens of cafes and restaurants and a really, really buzzy scene. I struck up a conversation with a guy from Lebanon. He suggested a boat ride on the Tigris. I agreed. He suggested a coffee. I agreed. He asked about my travels and how long I'd been away from home. And when I told him that I had left London in February, he asked me what I did for sex. Well, nothing, I told him. Oh, he said, it's very difficult, isn't it? I just shrugged. Well, how about helping me out? Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. Why not? All I could think of to say was, I don't think my mother would approve. He kept pushing, and once again, I was worried about making a fuss and drawing my attention to myself, he suggested a sort of bet. Dominoes was a local favourite. Everybody played it. We should play as well, and whoever got to 100 points first would be the loser, and the winner would choose the fine. I couldn't think of a way out, and I conceded. We went to a cafe, sat down, and started to play, and I quickly racked up losses and soon reached over 90. But then I had a stroke of luck. He was stuck with a really bad hand, and I was saved. After that narrow escape, I really didn't feel like hanging around Baghdad, and I found a seat on an overnight shirut to Amman in Jordan. We left at dusk, and after a 10-hour journey, we arrived mid-morning. Now, if the Kotel in Jerusalem was the primary destination of this trip, Petra was a definite second. My mother would often talk about the rose-red city half as old as time, and I knew that it was a magnet for Israelis, though of course getting there by crossing the border fence was illegal and highly dangerous, and many had died in the attempt. Anyway, I found a bus going south, but it broke down, and it was the middle of the afternoon before its replacement dropped me at Wadi Musa at the entrance to the site. I started to walk through the Sikh, the famous kilometre-long narrow canyon with its 600-foot walls lining the sides, and keenly aware that only a few weeks earlier a group of French archaeologists had been caught in a flash flood and been drowned. I can still recall, though, the magical first sight of the facade of the treasury peering through the rocks, projecting from the sides of the canyon at its end. But it was getting late, and that's all I could see, and I had no time to explore further. By the time that I got back to the entrance, it was nearly dark. Petra was then little visited, and there were no facilities at all, nowhere to stay, not even a kiosk. I had a vague idea that I would spend the night in Ma'an, the nearest town, but no certainty of how I would get there. But my luck seemed to be in. I saw a lorry and wandered over. The driver was packing up work for the day, and he offered me a lift into town. Ma'an lay at the far side of the Amman to Aqaba highway, and as we crossed it, I saw a petrol station and a convoy of cars, their bonnets pointing northwards, which is in my direction. I decided to take a chance. Thanking the driver, I got down from the lorry, crossed the road, and approached the driver in the lead car. "Can I please have a lift?" "Where to?" "Amman or Jerusalem, whichever." "Go and sit in the last car," he said. Greatly relieved, I did. After a while, the door was opened. A different man asked me who I was and where I was going. I explained my approximate itinerary. Had I recognized the driver I had spoken to? He wanted to know. I said no. That, he said, was His Majesty King Hussein, rather proudly. I didn't know the Arabic for Paul the other one, so I just sat there, smiled, and said nothing. He left, and the convoy got underway. After an hour or so, we stopped. I got out to find out what was going on. I could see the tail lights of the first car parked by itself 100 yards further up the road. In the dark, I picked my way cautiously towards it. No one stopped me. When I reached the car, I found the king and his wife, Princess Muna, standing by the open boot, drinking coffee and eating sandwiches. They invited me to join them. Hussein asked about my travels and whether I was enjoying his country. I explained that I had only just arrived that morning from Iraq, but was planning to spend a few days in Jordan before crossing over into Israel. Hussein was relaxed and charming, and he reminisced about his happy days in Sandhurst. When it was time to go, he asked me where I planned to sleep. "Oh, I'll find the YMCA or hostel." "No," he said, "you will stay at the Philadelphia Hotel as my guest." Then he courteously walked me back towards my car. Halfway he stopped. "Look," he said, "you are obviously travelling on a shoestring, and I would like you to enjoy my country in comfort. Please take this." And extracting a bundle of notes from his pocket, he offered them to me. Instinctively, I declined, but he pointed out that while he never would have made the gesture in England, here in Jordan, Arab rules of hospitality prevail, and I would be insulting him if I refused. Put like that, I could only accept. Back in the car, I counted the money. It was more than I had spent since leaving Haifa. The following morning, I found a taxi bound for Jerusalem. We took the road down from Amman to the Jordan Valley, crossed the Allenby Bridge, and were soon climbing from Jericho up to East Jerusalem. The driver, who had relatives in Jaffa and Haifa, tuned the radio to Reshet Aleph, the Israeli radio station, and whenever the time was broadcast in Hebrew, I reflexively looked at my watch, and then I tried to hide the gesture. The driver just smiled. In East Jerusalem, I checked into the YMCA and then went to the British consulate to register my intended crossing of the Mandelbaum Gate. You had to spend at least 3 days in Jordan before you could cross. It was now Monday, so I applied for a slot on the Thursday afternoon. Then I set out to find the Kotel, which was no easy task. It was marked on no maps, and my request for directions got me peculiar looks. May 1964 was a period of great tension. The recently formed PLO was about to hold a major rally in the old city, and security was tight. But I'd come far too far to be deterred, and finally, around a corner and down a narrow passage, I found the wall, standing silent and alone, its mellow yellow stones warmed by the bright sun, vegetation sprouting greenly between them. It was incredibly peaceful. No Arabs, no Jews, no noise, no arguments, just me and the wall. I stood a while in contemplation, wrote my messages, inserted them into the cracks, and left. And that is what it looked like when I walked towards it. That was in 1964. And you turned right at the end, and then extended that way. Still in the old city, I visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and on the way back to the YMCA, I popped into the nearby garden tomb, considered by some Protestants to be the real site of Jesus' burial and resurrection. In contrast to its Catholic counterpart in the old city, which was all smoke, incense, crowds and controversy, the garden tomb was a haven of tranquility. The next day, with the king's cash in my pockets, I purchased a pair of binoculars, which I still have, hired a taxi, and visited the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Cave of Machpelah in Hebron, the Qumran Caves in Jericho. At the YMCA, I had made friends with the group, and with some of them, made a return visit to Petra. We left Jerusalem very early for the 5-hour journey, breakfasted in Ma'an, hired horses at the entrance to the gorge, and spent a wonderful leisurely day exploring the whole of the site from the comfort of the saddle. And during those 3 days, of course, I went back to the Kotel as often as I could. After all, I thought, when would I get another opportunity to visit? And then the day came for me to cross into West Jerusalem. I went to the office where the guy who stamped my permit gave me a very dirty look. I returned to the YMCA, picked up my rucksack, said goodbye to my friends, and after a final visit to the Kotel, made my way towards the street that led to the Mandelbaum Gate. Another stamp, another dirty look, and I set off. The road sloped upwards. The gate itself was below the far side of the brow of the hill and invisible. I started the long walk up the hill. I was the only person crossing, and perhaps somewhat fancifully, I felt the eyes of the guard boring into my back. I expected to be recalled at any minute, but I wasn't. I reached the top of the hill, and there was the Mandelbaum Gate, the Israeli flag flying brightly in the sun, and the welcoming message, Bruchim Habayim Eretz Israel. I was home. And that really is the end of the story, except for a short postscript. On Shabbat, a week or two later, I went to a shul on Mea Sharim, and when the Hasidim there heard that I just stood at the kotel, they looked at me in wonderment. "He's been to the kotel," they whispered. "He's been to the kotel." And they came and touched me, as if by doing so, some of the kedusha that I had received by praying at the wall could somehow, by osmosis, be transferred to them. It was very moving. I've travelled to many other places since 1964, some of them quite exotic, and perhaps because it was my first solo trip, perhaps because age somehow diminishes excitement in new places, I've never experienced again the same intensity as I did on that journey. Thank you for listening to this talk. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. That was amazing. I'd like to open for questions. If anyone wants to ask Emmanuel questions, unmute yourself. I just want to ask you, Emmanuel, you talked about very quickly when you finally reached the kotel and went down the hill, and it wasn't a particularly open space. But how did you feel when you actually got there? This was the reason that you went through this incredible journey.
Well, it was very emotional, very, very emotional. I was the only person there. I knew that nobody, other Jews couldn't go unless they were diplomats. It had taken me a long time to get there. I just thought it was just a wonderful. No, it wasn't anticlimactic at all. On the contrary, it sort of made the whole thing worth it. You just saw something that you sort of look at it and go and think, well, that was there 2,000 years ago, and Jews have been coming here as often as they can in the last 2,000 years. So really, quite special.
Lawrence, we took that photograph that Manuel showed you back to the kotel some years ago, and the whole plaza has been lowered about 5 meters, but we identified the stones, and there's the same greenery between the stones as there was in the picture. But it was quite extraordinary. Things don't change.
Yeah. Do you remember what message you put in?
No. No.
Really, you don't? Okay.
Emmanuel?
It's 55 years ago.
Okay.
Emmanuel?
Yes.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. Obviously, this was an important event in your life as a young man. So my question is, how did it influence your life after, and how did it affect your opinions about either the Arab world or Israel?
Who was that before?
Okay.
Who is it?
I think it gave me a great sense of
Put
confidence.
this one down.
It was something that I decided to do by myself.
Put this one down.
There had been some opposition from
Put
home.
this one down there and watch this. There's a synagogue. Yes, I know.
Michael, mute, please.
There were periodical messages from home saying, don't go, don't go, don't go. But I ignored them. I knew it was dangerous, but I thought, on the balance of probabilities, it would probably be all right. And anyway, once I'd got as far as Iran, there was no way I was going to turn back and go back. So I just carried on. And it certainly gave me a sense that, however bad things might be, you can get through them. And in fact, well, curiously, I'm quite taken with all the hospitality that I've received in Arab countries. And the following year, I went with my sister we did a road journey through Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And then we found the same thing. And of course, this was before 1967. I was quite surprised. I hadn't got to these Arab countries that I've traveled through had been quite hospitable to me, and yet I knew about their antagonism to Israel. It was quite difficult to balance the one against the other. And after '67,
Thank you.
Emmanuel, can you hold on 1 second, please? Could Michael be muted? Because we're picking up a lot of sounds, and no one can hear Emmanuel.
I'm sorry. It was a package that was undone. I'll make sure it's distributed.
Thank you.
It was a fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Emmanuel.
any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes,
Emmanuel,
Yes.
thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm in the southwest at the moment, so the reception's not so great. I didn't quite understand. You were in Baghdad. Who were you playing dominoes with? I didn't understand that.
Some Lebanese guy who had befriended me.
Aha. And what did you think his intentions were?
Oh, sinister.
Well, for him, normal, I suppose. One of the things I did notice in Arab countries, particularly in Iraq, was how men would walk around hand in hand.
Yeah,
It was quite normal to see 20-somethings walking down the street holding each other's hand.
Yeah.
So, you know, he's.
But I used to, I mean, when I used to go to, for work in East Jerusalem, you know, you used to see that around the Salah al-Din, around there. But so what did he what were you playing the dominoes game? What was the
Well, it was a bet. He wanted me to help him out, and I said no. And he said, well, he was implying, I've given you a ride on the Tigris, I've given you a coffee in a cafe, sort of, you owe me. And I said no. He said, well, look, let's have a bet. And you know, when you're in a place like Baghdad, I really wasn't very worried about making a fuss. You know, all I wanted to do was sort of keep a low profile. So he said, okay, we'll have a bet. And the dominoes was the bet. Unfortunately, he lost. Don't ask him how I would have got out of it if he'd have won, but you know, I probably would have worked out something.
It's like it sounds like a scene out of a film, Emmanuel.
Fortunately, nothing bad happened. Nothing bad came of it.
Emmanuel, were you ever tempted to make contact with, or try to make contact with Hussein?
I wrote him a very nice letter, and I never got a reply.
Maybe he'd sussed you out by then.
What?
Maybe he'd sussed who you were by then.
No, he knew. I think he knew I was Jewish. I don't think it bothered him.
No.
You know, somebody's coming, says he's going to Israel crossing over in 3 days' time. He might have known I was Jewish, but Mark Butler. Yeah, he had a lot of Israeli friends. Some of his best friends were Jewish. At least they didn't want to assassinate him.
Right.
So some of your best friends are kings.
Oliver Sholem, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Anyway. Anybody else?
Anyone else have a question?
Yeah, Manny, it's Andrew. You rang me a couple of times during lockdown, remember, to find out.
I do.
And I coped. I'm through it, right?
Good. So am I.
Yeah.
I thought it was quite interesting, actually. They sent me this list of 40 people to contact, between Edwina and me, and I was the oldest person on the list.
Yes, I thought you were older than me. It was very funny. I just want to ask you, did you get your passport back?
Oh yes. Not only that, there was a little very nice story actually attached to that, because I got back to Israel on the Thursday. On the Friday morning, I took the bus straight down to Ben Gurion, and I picked up my passport and fill-in from the El Al office. And on the way back to Jerusalem on the bus, there was a very, very pretty girl who I got chatting to, and it turned out that she was Miss Israel the previous year, and she'd come third in the Miss World tournament in London the previous November.
He was blessed having been to the Kotel.
Exactly.
And then what happened?
Well, we had a relationship for a while, and then we parted. I just had a relationship.
Did you leave her your tefillin?
What?
Did you play dominoes with her?
Maybe. Her name was Sarah Talmy. She was a twin, one of a twin. And I think it was her twin sister who entered the competition, the Miss World competition in London. But because they were absolutely identical, her sister didn't have to go to all the events. And sometimes Sarah substituted from her at some of the pre-competition events that they had to go through. But so it was timing rather than anything else. We happened to be on the same bus at the same time. I obviously must have had this trip, if not to the Kotel, a trip to Persia in my mind when I left London, which is why I went with 2 passports in the first place.
Yeah.
There was one that I used just for Israel and one for everywhere else.
Yeah, that's common. Yes.
Yeah.
I think you can probably still do it. Although
Israel doesn't put stamps anymore.
No, they don't. That's true. I've got one vestigial stamp from 8 years ago, the last one that they put in, I think in 2011 or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you get your Fiat back, and did you drive home?
I got my Fiat back, and I stayed in Israel for another 5 months after I got back working, and I drove back at the end of November, put it on the ship to Istanbul, and drove straight home through Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Italy, Switzerland, France. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good advert for a Fiat.
Good advert. Oh, I had terrible troubles with that Fiat. I won't go into those. Terrible. That's a story in itself.
Emmanuel, you sent me 2 photographs, one which appeared on the flyer, but there was another one as well, which I'm not going to share. Where were you at that particular place? Because
it was on the flyer. It wasn't the one I sent you. I thought I sent you one standing in front of the border with between Turkey and Iran. No, the one I sent you was in the middle of nowhere. There are some mountains in the background which you can faintly see, which are Mount Ararat. And I looked for the ark, but I didn't have any binoculars then, so I couldn't see it. But I'm sure it was up there somewhere.
But what caught my eye was you. It looked like at a border or something, and behind you was a car, which was actually, I think, a Farsal Vega. It was a very special car.
But that's not the one on the flyer.
No, I know the admin didn't use that one. They used just the one of you on your own.
Right. There was one interesting thing I noticed about that one, taken on my own. I'm actually wearing a tie.
Yes, I noticed that as well.
Why would I be wearing a tie traveling through there? Doesn't make sense. Anyway, I think we were probably more formal then.
Did it change you when you finished this journey? Were you? I mean, was this a pivotal moment in your life, or you've always been, as my mother would use the word, had lots of pluck? You know, I mean, I can't.
Well, look, I was sent away from home at the age of 10 to boarding school, and I was away from 8 years in boarding school or Gateshead. So, you know, when you're living your own between 10 and 18, you sort of become adaptable and learn to cope with what life throws at you.
Gateshead.
He is very plucky.
Yeah.
He pushes boundaries, he crosses red lines very happily. So this was just the beginning.
Well, one evening when I got back to Jerusalem, I was staying with my aunt and uncle who lived in Beth Kerem. They lived on the top floor flat of a building. And one night I came home late. I'd been out at a party or something, and I found that I didn't have my key, and I didn't want to wake them up. So I climbed a drain pipe 3 stories up the side of the building. You know, the Jerusalem stone, they're sort of reasonably, you know, they're good footholds, but the drain pipe, it was damp and slippery. And halfway up, I thought this was a stupid thing to do. But then I thought, well, if you can get through Iraq and Jordan, you can get up a drain pipe. So that sort of stupid thing.
Very few people go from Gateshead to Tehran and Baghdad. I mean, it's
You're right. You're right. I didn't see many other Gateshead people there. Not that I recognise.
Amazing story. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
One of the most amusing stories, my stories we've had. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you guys for listening.